I'm going to touch on the topics of the situation for lesbians in Belgium. I'm going to talk about the gender ID services, and I'm going to also talk a little bit about the topic of detransition. So all of the information that I'm going to share in my presentation will be based on my own experiences and on my perspective as a female detransitioner. So who identified as a lesbian from the age of 14, then identified as a trans man, and started to medically transition from the age of 16 to the age of 20, where I started to detransition. As mentioned by Vanessa earlier, I grew up in Brussels, and I'm French speaking. So everything that I will be talking about will be not focused on the French-speaking side of Belgium. I try to research as much as possible on the Flemish side as well, but it might be a bit influenced by that. I just wanted to be clear with that. So I'm going to start talking about my own experiences. So as I said, I came out as a lesbian when I was 15. And from that age, I started to search for other organizations where I could find other lesbians to talk to meet, to exchange with. And unfortunately, I couldn't find anything. I was searching, and I could only find other types of organization, but nothing lesbian specific. And I still share that same observation that today lesbian organizations are very hard to find, lesbian specific organizations. So here I showed, for example, the Google results of like when I search for Belgian lesbian organization, all of the results are LGBT+, LGBTQI, and it's really, really hard to find something lesbian specific. I talked to other lesbians in Belgium in the Flemish side and the French-speaking side, and they share the same observation. In general, it's hard to find spaces that are lesbian specific. So back to my 15-year-old self, I was questioning myself a lot, and I was quite isolated as a lesbian. And I started to ask myself, why don't I feel like a woman? Why am I more masculine than the other girls? All of these kind of questions. So I started researching, and this is how I found the website of a trans organization. But sorry, I missed some information that I wanted to mention before about lesbian organizations. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of lesbian initiatives in Belgium and show you that, unfortunately, for the most of them, they're not lesbian specific. And for example, here you can see the L Festival, which you could think is lesbian centered, but a lot of these events are actually focused on trans people. For example, I checked their program here because so every year they organize a series of, as they say, lesbian, bi, trans, and feminist events. And this year I looked at their program, and in February they organized an event called T-Tutorial that was aimed at teaching people how to self-inject testosterone. And it was organized by two trans people without any supervision of a medical professional. Now, another example of a lesbian space. So Mothers and Daughters, this is a bar that opened a few years ago, and that was simply called Mothers and Daughters and known as a lesbian bar. And recently it changed its name, and now it's Mothers and Daughters, a lesbian and trans bar. During the lockdown, they had to close, and the main activity that they've been doing was selling this new beer called Transition, which they sell, and all the proceeds go to a trans solidarity fund. So this is something that's very much not about lesbians, even though this is an initiative from a lesbian bar. So this is the kind of thing that you're confronted a lot with as a lesbian in Belgium. So now I'm going to talk about the trans organization that I mentioned earlier. So when I started questioning myself and I started researching on all these questions that I had about myself, I came across this trans organization. I saw on their website that they organized counseling appointments. that you could book with a psychotherapist. So I decided to do that. I went there and I told them about the fact that I didn't feel like a woman, that I could not relate to the other girls. And they directly told me about testosterone treatment and what this treatment could do to the appearance of my body. And they told me about surgeries that were possible or not. And they gave me some flyers to help me come out as trans to my family. So now I'm going to talk a bit more about this specific organization. They so they organize these they have these counseling services in several Belgian cities, and they also organize workshops to raise awareness on the topic of trans identity. On their website, they have a statement in which they explain their positioning against the gender teams that are in Belgium. So in Belgium, there are two gender teams, one in Liège, in the French-speaking side of Belgium, and one in Ghent, in the Flemish-speaking side of Belgium. The one in Ghent is the biggest one, and the one that I will focus on later. So this trans organization positioned themselves against the system of the gender teams. So they mainly criticize the fact that the gender teams require a psychiatric consultation before the start of any medical treatment. They also criticize the fact that gender teams the system of gender teams is too rigid and that it's too binary. So now I'm gonna read you a small quote from that article that is very explanatory of their position. So they wrote, trans identity is still considered a mental illness, but who knows who you are and whether or not what you say about yourself is true and by what criteria. Only you hold the keys to your identity. It is a way of putting trans people under guardianship, to judge them as incapable of thinking for themselves. Jean Pluriel categorically refuses to allow people to be obliged to go through a psychiatrist who evaluates their identity. Yes, so indeed, the approach of gender teams is very different. I'm going to focus on the biggest gender team, the one that is in Ghent. And so indeed, they require a psychiatric diagnosis before being able to access any treatment. They work with the gender dysphoria diagnosis from the DSM-5. So they write on their website that for a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, the person must clearly express and experience a different gender from the one that others would ascribe to him or her. This must be the case for at least 6 months. In children, the desire to belong to the other gender must be present and the child must express it. According to this diagnosis, the condition causes clinically significant suffering, limitations in social or occupational school functioning, or in functioning in other important areas. So here I highlighted for at least 6 months because I found it quite striking. I was actually expecting they would be longer, but apparently if the patient has a feeling of belonging to the other gender for more than 6 months, then it's sufficient to access treatments. So when diagnosed with gender dysphoria, the following procedures are possible. So puberty blockers can be given from the onset of puberty. Cross-sex hormones can be given from the age of 16. A mastectomy is permitted from the age of 17. And further surgeries, including sex reassignment surgeries, are available from the age of 18. On the website, puberty blockers are described simply as putting puberty on hold to give the patient time to explore their gender identity. It is stated that normal puberty will resume if they are stopped and fertility will not be affected. There is not any other information on puberty blockers and on the fact that little is known about the long-term effects of such medications. All of the information that I put here is the information that you can find on their website. They also explain that they have a very long waiting list due to an increasingly high demand for transgender care. So here there's a graph where you can see the big increase that occurred in the number of patients accessing the clinic. In red, you can see the amount of minors, so under the age of 18, and in blue, you can see the amount of adult patients. They further explained that because of these these long waiting times, there are two different options to transition. You can do it through the gender team and it will take longer, but you can also do it outside of the gender team. And they have a list of professionals that you can go to and you can contact in order to do your transition outside of the gender team. And they seem to even encourage it by saying that it is much faster to do it that way. Now, there's also a third option for transitioning. So this is an option that is offered by the trans organization that I talked about earlier. They, because of the fact that they are in opposition to the system of gender clinics, they created their own, what they call trans inter-psychomedical social network. So the goal of this network is to depathologize and decentralize treatments for trans and intersex people. So basically, you can get in contact with this trans organization, and they will give you, they will redirect you to doctors that will be able to give you access to medical transition. So, for example, in my case, that's how I accessed transition. So when I was 16, they redirected me and my parents to a gynecologist who was specialized in prescribing hormones. And he reassured the gynecologist talked to my parents and reassured them because they were skeptical at the time. And he said that there was no reason to wait. And he accepted to prescribe me the hormones from the first appointment. Now I'm going to talk about what happened after I started transitioning. So I started taking testosterone at the age of 15, then I got a mastectomy a few months later at the age of 17, and at the age of 20, a lot of things changed in my life and I decided to detransition. My partner and I, so my partner is also a female detransitioner, we decided to create a project that is called PostTrans. And it's a project from mainly female detransitioners to share their stories. We share their stories in many different languages, and we try to give as much visibility as possible to this issue. We also try to provide resources on the topic of detransition. Unfortunately, in Belgium, I have tried to start the conversation about detransition, but it is very hard because the LGBTQI and trans-specific organizations are in general very hostile to the topic. And I have been rejected and I have been removed from support groups because of this project that I have started. We recently launched a booklet with information on detransition. Here you can see the French and the Dutch versions of the booklet, but it also exists in English and German and soon in Spanish and Portuguese and hopefully many other languages. You can find it on our website on posttrans.com /detransition-booklet. Yeah, if you go on our website, you can order copies and we can send some to your organization. With this booklet, we're really trying to raise awareness on experiences of detransitioners and to make a resource available, hopefully in as many organizations as possible for people who consider transition or detransition. So as a conclusion, based on everything that I've talked about, here are my concerns. So in general, I think that I observe that there's a big lack of spaces where lesbians can meet and exchange. And for young lesbians, it's very detrimental to their identity and it's really isolating in general. I also see that there's a normalization of gender nonconformity as a reason to undergo medical treatments and surgeries. Gender nonconforming women and gender nonconforming men and girls and boys are very often encouraged to take a transition path because of the fact that they don't fit the very strict definition of what a woman or a man should be. Also, what I find really worrying is the very fast access to medical transition. So, for example, as someone who transitioned, so I came out, I started my hormones and I had a mastectomy within the span of 1 year. And I know that it is a common experience. And I think that's something that is far too fast, and this is really dangerous because it leads people to make decisions in a rush and potentially regret them later. Due to the fact, as I mentioned, that medical transition, all the different ways that you can have to medically transition, and the fact that it's so decentralized, it's really hard to gather data around the long-term effects of treatment and also around transition regret. So we actually don't know. For example, in Belgium, I couldn't find any data about transition regret, for example, and detransition rates. That's something that's completely unknown. And there's a lot of hostility towards the topic of detransition because it is said that it is something so rare and that doesn't need to be talked about, but we actually don't know what we're talking about. We don't know what are the numbers, and because this is so difficult to be recorded.